As the war in Ukraine enters its 50th day, Ukraine disputes Russia's claims that it has taken the strategic city of Mariupol.
Russia's defense ministry says one of its warships is seriously damaged after an explosion on board. Ukrainian officials claim the ship has been hit by their rockets. This has not been independently confirmed.
It comes as today marks 50 days since the start of the invasion. We can get the latest from Ukraine with our correspondent Dan Johnson. Jan, specifically, can you just tell us about this incident with the warship? Do we have any more details about that?
We have confirmation from the Russians that the ship is seriously damaged, that it is sitting off the south coast, not far from Odessa. They say the crew has been rescued after a fire on board, which actually detonated some of the ship's ammunition. Now, the Russians haven't explained how that fire started, what the cause of that was, but Ukrainian officials say that is the result of their rocket attack, that they hit this ship, which is the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, a huge cruiser with heavy armour, heavy weaponry, something that can launch intense missile attacks. They say that they've been successful in hitting it and taking it out, starting that fire on board. People may remember at the start of the invasion, this was the ship that first approached a Ukrainian island in the Black Sea, and the Ukrainian border guards there sent a message back to it in no uncertain terms, very unpolitely, saying that it should go away. Well, the regional governor in Odessa now says that the ship has finally done what the Ukrainian border guards told it to back then.
And Dan, as we take stock 50 days since the start of the war, we know that there is this whole battle around the strategic city of Mariupol, which has been besieged for so many weeks now. Different claims about whether that city has fallen entirely to Russian troops. What can you tell us on that score?
Yes, those claims go back and forth. For a couple of days now, the Russians have been saying that they've completed their takeover of Mariupol, but the Ukrainian resistance there says that it manages to cling on. There were reports yesterday of Ukrainian Marines surrendering en masse. Russia said 1,000 of them had handed themselves over, and there were some pictures released claiming to show that. We weren't able to verify those pictures, and the Ukrainian military denies that there have been mass surrenders in that city and says its defence of Mariupol is still continuing to some degree, but the situation there is particularly desperate, and it does feel like Russia will complete its takeover of that city at some point soon. But the people of Mariupol have suffered for longer than anyone else in this conflict, and what that would mean for the estimated 100 or 120,000 people who remain in that city, goodness only knows. One of the aides to the city's mayor said yesterday that he'd been told by Russian officials that they planned a victory parade through that city in early May. Well, given the level of destruction, that would be a peculiar sort of victory celebration. That city has been repeatedly bombarded. The devastation of its towns, of its streets, of its residential blocks is clear for everyone to see. President Zelensky last night welcomed further US military aid to help the Ukrainian defense forces. There are more helicopters, lightweight drones, artillery and armoured personnel carriers on the way to help the Ukrainians dig in the east. And he said that even with significant stocks of equipment and high numbers of troops, the Russian soldiers doubted their own ability to break Ukraine's defences. He's also said that the Russian leadership should now be seeking peace or should remove itself from the international arena forever.
Now, it has been 50 days since the Russian invasion of Ukraine began. In that time, there have been some key moments in the conflict. Let's take a minute to recap on what has happened.
The invasion began in the early hours of Thursday, February the 24th, when President Putin announced a special military operation. Minutes later, missiles and airstrikes hit across Ukraine, including the capital, Kyiv.
Within days, the UK, along with the European Union and the United States, announced even tough sanctions on the Russian state. More than 100 individuals with links to Vladimir Putin. One of the most high-profile, of course, being the former Chelsea owner, Roman Abramovich.
2 weeks on, we learned the scale of the devastation in the port city of Mariupol. An estimated 300 people are thought to have died when a theatre sheltering civilians, mostly women and children, was targeted in a Russian missile strike.
It's been more than 2 weeks since both sides met for talks. In the last round held in Turkey, Russia said it would drastically reduce its military combat operations in 2 key areas.
Now, Russian forces have begun withdrawing from towns surrounding the capital, Kyiv, where the full extent of the horrors of what happened in places like Bucha have been unfolded. Reports of rapes, indiscriminate killings and images showing bodies in mass graves are continuing to emerge.
Well, our security correspondent Frank Gardner is with us in the studio. Morning to you, Frank.
Morning, Charlie.
We've kind of bombarded people with a lot of information in a short space of time there. 50 days in. Can you give us a sort of marker about where you think that we are?
Sure. It's in a kind of operational pause right now, but don't be fooled by that. I think some of the most intense fighting is still to come. So if you look at it in terms of phases, phase one is over. Russia didn't do that well in it. The reason it's withdrawn for the north is not because of some great magnanimous gesture. It's because they were beaten, frankly. The Ukrainians put up far stiffer resistance than they thought. The government didn't collapse. The plan didn't work. But they have taken land in the south. They've now got pretty much a whole corridor from Crimea, which they seized illegally and annexed in 2014, all the way up to the Donbass. But the Donbass, the area in the east of Ukraine, is where the bulk of Ukraine's armed forces, their best forces, are dug in. They've had months to prepare for this. Russia is amassing a huge force to try and take that. President Putin needs to show that this is a success. He's got Victory Day coming up in Moscow on May the 9th. By then, he needs to be able to show that this special military operation, another word for a war, has been worth it, because they've lost a huge amount of troops, over 10,000 reportedly.
But what does success look like then? What would he want to show exactly?
He needs to be able to show that he has, in his mind, or his words, neutralised Ukraine as a threat to Russia. Now, I think plenty of people would argue that Ukraine was never a threat to Russia, but Ukraine did want to join NATO, and he saw that as a threat. Ukraine has said, that's okay, we don't need to join NATO now, forget about that. I think the hard part is going to come with when the fighting is over. Let's see where the troops end up. Now, if Ukraine is successful and defeats Russia in the eastern part of Ukraine, then they'll be in quite a strong position. But Russia, I think, is going to keep throwing weapons, missiles, artillery shells, ammunition and people at this until they can secure most of the Donbass, and he can say, right, we've done an operation to protect the Russian-speaking minority, and we're going to keep that bit. I think almost certainly they won't want to give up Crimea. So some tough compromises would have to be taken by the Ukrainian government, and they're not going to feel easy until there is some kind of international guarantee and probably some sort of peacekeeping force that stops this happening again. But we could be months away from that. There could be an awful lot of attrition still to come.
You will have heard, Frank, and we all have conversations people have about why we don't do more, why the rest of the world doesn't do more practically to help. And it's a familiar argument because you don't want to escalate. But is there areas during the 50 days, have we gradually pushed further in terms of the equipment we're prepared to offer? Is that creeping forward?
It is, and largely because of the atrocities. Every single revelation that you've been talking about there, the mass graves, the dead bodies, the very well reported and documented atrocities, including rape, that has stripped away a lot of the inhibitions that NATO had about supplying more and more equipment. So, if anything, it's accelerating. The Ukrainians they've got a relatively small but quite professional, well-trained army, and they've been able to hold off the Russians in the north because of the high-tech equipment that they provided them. Javelin, Starstreak, missiles that will shoot down planes and kill tanks, and they're doing that very effectively. The Russian army has not performed well so far. The Ukrainians have. That's not to say that the Russians are going to lose necessarily in the Donbass, but you're right. So the big question now is, does NATO provide bigger things like warplanes? At some stage, Putin is going to say, you've crossed the line, we're going to start retaliating on NATO supply lines. If that happens on NATO's side of the border, we're in trouble, because then potentially that triggers what's called Article 5 and brings in NATO. People who say, why don't we have a no-fly zone? The reason why NATO doesn't want to do that and why they've ruled it out is that means shooting down Russian pilots and firing missiles at Russian air defense sites, and then you're into a pan-European war, effectively World War III. And, I'm sorry to, nobody in NATO is keen to take the risk that we go to war with Russia. So the trick is to provide Ukraine with everything possible up to, but stopping short of fighting Russia.
What worries me in all of this, Frank, is that we become, as viewers, people watching on almost desensitised to the horrors of what's going on there. I was reading more accounts on the BBC News website yesterday about what's being uncovered in that northern area around Kiev, and it is gut-wrenching. And yet, the more these cases pile on, the more it just becomes almost like an everyday occurrence, and it shouldn't be. We should never remove our eyes from really seeing what's happening there and what has happened.
We shouldn't, and unfortunately, you know, people do become inured. I mean, terrible things happened in Afghanistan and in Yemen, and to some extent, you know, in Yemen are still going on. You're right. The difference here, I think, is that partly because you've got some very well-trained lawyers involved, and a lot of Ukrainians have got smartphones, some people will be held to account for this. Now, they may never see the light or the darkness of a courtroom, but they will be banned from travelling forever. There are over 500 names the Ukrainians have got of the people who ordered and took part in these atrocities, and they will never be able to leave Russia.